Okay.
Hello, hello. Welcome to Talkin in the Free World. I'm Mariam and Azar. Talkin in the Free World is a production of Canada's Macdonald-Laurier Institute. I am absolutely thrilled to have with me today Azar Nafisi, an author who I have had the great honor to have known for decades now and respect so very much. Azar Nafisi has a brand new book out called Reading Dangerously. Azar Nafisi, welcome to the program.
Thank you so much, Marianne John. As always, it's such a pleasure to be talking to you.
Thank you very much for making time to be with us, especially in your busy schedule, launching your book. I know it's been out now, and I see it in bookstores at the very front, and it gives me so much pride. Let me just do a quick introduction. Azar Nafisi is, of course, the author of Reading Lolita in Tehran, an international hit translated into 32 languages, a bestseller. She is, for the Iranian people, of course, very much one of our own. And as I mentioned, a big source of pride. In addition to that book, of course, she's a literary critic and an academic, a scholar in Iran and at Johns Hopkins University for many years. She has also written in both Persian and English other books, including Things I Have Been Silent About and A Republic of Imagination. And of course, as I mentioned, most recently, Read Dangerously. Let me begin with just a couple of anecdotes. When I was very young, still a student, I remember Azar Nafisi was still living in Iran, and I was struck so much by her courage because she would travel to the United States for conferences that Mahnaza Afkhami, the former Minister for Women's Affairs prior to the revolution in Iran, would organize under the auspices of Sisterhood is Global or Women's Learning Partnership. And Azar would come and she would say the most dangerous and daring things and then travel back to Iran. And I was just, I was always very struck. And then, of course, she wrote Reading Lolita in Tehran. And I remember an anecdote that Carl Gershman, the founder and head of the National Endowment for Democracy, told that they would correspond over fax and talk about the University of Fredonia. And even when Azar Nafisi was still in Tehran and doing very dangerous things with literature and her imagination. So, and you may be familiar, as I mentioned, with her other books, including Republic of Imagination, which I really love the cover of, done by Peter Sis, who I adore his work. Let me begin, Azar, with a question about the book very, very directly. And of course, our entire conversation will be about the book as a launch pad for a broader discussion about both the United States, the free world in general, and Iran, because you traverse between all of these worlds in this book. Why did you write this in particular, and how is its purpose distinct from your other books?
Well, Mariam John, first of all, thank you so much for that introduction and for reminding me of those days. The idea for this book came out of my deep frustrations with how things were going on. Well, in both countries I had called home. In Iran, there was a new wave of violence by the regime. There were protests and jail and harassment and torture and killing. And in United States, there were these totalitarian trends that I noticed. You know, when you have experienced, gone through a totalitarian experience, you become very sensitive and sensitized towards it in the new home that you choose. And so for me, the first signs of this totalitarian trend was in its attempt to fabricate, to deny reality, and to replace it with something that does not exist, with illusions. And so whenever I'm frustrated, I usually turn to writing and reading. But this time I just needed to have a real conversation. And so in my diaries, I started writing letters to everyone. Of my father, of course, but to Donald Trump even, just responding to him in terms of his fabrications. And by and by, this obsession took over so much that I felt it needs to be investigated. I need to come out of this mode of constant outrage and do something about it. And writing puts that necessary distance with reality that helps you see things and in a clarified way. And so, to make a long story short, I realized that I can't write letters randomly. They would be too random for a book. So then I started writing letters to the writer. What are we going to do? There's this weird noise. I can't. Every time I talk, I don't understand what I'm saying. Okay, now, no, there's this noise. Can you hear it? I can't hear you. I can't hear you. And there's this weird noise, really loud. Okay, now I can't. Now I don't hear it.
Yeah, we're just experiencing some technical difficulties there, Azar, and I think Mariam's going to rejoin in just a second.
Okay, so I should just wait.
Yep, just give it a second. There.
Okay.
Okay.
Okay. All right. Where shall I start from?
So you were talking about that you decided to write this book, and you have written it in the form of letters, mostly letters to your father. And let's take it from there.
Well, I haven't talked about my father as yet.
Okay.
At first I started writing to the writers that I had chosen, and it seemed a bit artificial and stilted, telling writers what their books are all about, And I was talking to actually a common friend of ours, Ladan Burumand, and I was telling her how frustrated I felt. I couldn't find the right person, the right interlocutor. And she said, why don't you find a third person to write to? And that gave me the idea of writing to a person whom all my life I had corresponded with anyway, namely my father. The first time my father wrote to me, I couldn't read or write. I was only 4 years old. And he created a diary addressing it to me and talking about our lives then and his aspirations for the future and what impact my presence in his life has had on him. And from that day on, there was this special conversation going on with my father. The first time I wrote to him, I was 6 years old, and he was studying at the American University in Washington. And I would write on scraps of paper just 1 or 2 lines, and he would respond to me as if I was a real person who could understand all the things that he was saying.
Wow.
And that is how this whole book started.
Yeah, and of course, your father was in your previous books, so your readers are familiar with him and how much he has meant to you your entire life, and your passion for literature, and your passion for your country, first country, Iran. So you talk about the tyrannical instinct, the totalitarian instinct, and how this is not necessarily related to a totalitarian regime. It can exist even within democracies, and that you see the United States grappling with this presently in the form of Donald Trump. And your father, in this book, you have some of the things that your father had written to U.S. presidents and about American politics. And your dad was concerned then too about how a country can be, particularly during the civil rights movement, can be free and with a very democratic constitution, and yet have injustices and the dynamic nature of this country to correct itself. So can you describe a bit about the totalitarian instinct as you see it in the United States? And then I have some questions about that for you.
Well, at the end of Reading Lolita, the last chapter, I paraphrase a question from Saul Bellow. He said, those who have survived the ordeal of Holocaust, how will they survive the ordeal of freedom? Because freedom is an ordeal. It is not something that is God-given.
Yeah.
People have died and are, as we speak, are dying for it every day all around the world. So what I felt from the moment I set foot in the United States again in 1997 was this trend where people were becoming polarized and seeking comfort. They didn't want to see freedom as an ordeal, because then you had to take action. And the first sign of any totalitarian mindset, the first targets of totalitarian mindsets are always women, minorities, and culture as a whole.
Yes.
Because culture, especially writing and journalism itself as well, they deal with facts and they deal with truth. Fiction deals with truth. It wants to find out, to investigate what lies behind appearances. And so truth becomes very dangerous, because once you know it, you cannot remain silent, you know. And I felt that too many of us were silent. And the first sign of it I saw in the system of education, where two trends exist in today's education in America. One is this corporate mentality, where it's very utilitarian. It doesn't tell you that knowledge in and of itself is important to especially a democracy, because from the first task of a citizen, that is voting, you need to know. You need to know about your past, you need to know about your values, and you need to know how to implement them. Therefore, voting becomes an act of knowledge, and if ignorance comes into it, then we have what we have right now. So that utilitarian mindset was constantly attacking humanities and liberal arts, imagination and ideas. And then, of course, alongside of it, we see how the rights of women have been eroding, and with minorities, America has always carried this contradiction within itself.
Yes.
On one hand, absolute freedom; on the other hand, racism and that kind of repression.
Yes. So let me ask you about you talk about Plato and the Republic and the analogy to the cave, and how people have a preference. And I was reminded actually by Carl Jung and the idea that people at some point in their life, he says at around 35, prefer to not have freedom. Do things to rob themselves of freedom because they seek comfort. And the you talk about Plato's cave analogy, and how in the eyes of Plato and the totalitarian mindset, people shouldn't be given the truth because it's too much for them, and that enlightenment and freedom can be painful. When you look at a country, your own country, Iran, and other countries similar to it that do not yet have a democratic government and are yearning and striving and aspiring for it, do you see more hopefulness than you see in a country like America that is already democratic and free?
People living in countries like Iran, one of the best examples apart from Iran is, for example, the former Soviet Union. When people are deprived of their freedoms, they appreciate what is now absent. They react to it in that manner. So in Iran, for example, Iranian women have felt the oppression with their skin and blood. They have been tortured for it. They have been flogged for it, so they instinctively understand the values of freedom. And you can tell that, for example, in Iran, by the slogans women choose to talk about, or the way they are standing up to the regime. One very important thing is how you react to your enemy. You cannot become like them. They spew hatred. You cannot just spew hatred back. You have to use democratic means to gain democratic ends. And Iran's civil society has discovered that. America, both on the far right and far left, have not. There is talk of democracy all the time, but it's not enough to talk about democracy. You need to be able to use means like the way Martin Luther King and James Baldwin used it. And you need, we talked about comfort, and we talked about how this society looks for comfort. It is not only the corporate mentality that brings this. It is also the ideological mentality, one that divides the world into black hats and white hats, and self-righteously puts himself or herself within the white hat group. So they don't need to think. We all say we hate dictators, but that's not true. as you said, freedom is not something that everyone wants. You brought Jung into it. Baldwin talks about it, that how afraid people are of, and that is why those who work in imagination and ideas become dangerous. As James Baldwin used to say, artists are here to disturb the peace. And that's what I tell the students whenever I go and talk, that you are here not to be comfortable, not to talk about yourself only, but to talk about others, to understand others, even your enemies. Because if you want to win, you have to know them.
Right. And you mentioned that ideology always needs an invented enemy. And you located that here in the United States also. And of course, right now we are, including last night, watching as a nation the January 6th hearings. I want to challenge your thoughts about America today and Trump. And I say this as somebody who was public about opposing Trump and took a lot of criticism for it. So just keep that in mind. What do you say to people, particularly Iranians or others who are fighting repressive regimes, when they say, yes, we understand all that is bad about Trump and Trumpism, but his policies on those regimes were more powerful and more effective? For example, on Iran, the idea that that a repressive regime, a corrupt regime, one that is terrorizing the world, should have maximum pressure on it, is more effective than a Biden approach of appeasement. What do you say to those people who make that deal with the devil, or maybe they don't even see it as the devil, that this is a much better choice? And I would say even it's not even necessarily limited to foreign policy. There are people, for example, I'm thinking of Mitt Romney, who strongly opposes Trump, but would, I'm sure, prefers a conservative economic policy or conservatism in almost any area, and opposes the Biden policy. What do you say to people who weigh and then come out saying, no, I'd rather vote Trump?
Well, we cannot only look at the world through what we perceive is our advantage. We have to go beyond that. Now, the whole point, first of all, in regards to Trump's policies, you have to have an understanding of whether he's coming at this policy because there are these values that he has to, he wants to guard, and like he's opposing the Iranian regime because he's pro-democracy, pro-freedom. Because the enemy of my enemy is not always my friend. And we notice this in people in the Trump camp, like Giuliani, like Pompeo. Whom do they approach as opposition to the regime? An organization like Mujahedin Khalq,
the MEK.
The MLK is a terrorist organization. It's a cult, and they openly support it. So I don't look at it superficially. And one thing that worried me about Trump was the fact that he was prepared to be in the same camp as the worst dictators in the world, like Putin and Kim Jong-un. And he only based his policies on whether they liked him or not. So at any moment, he could turn out to like the regime and create a dialogue. And I have nothing against dialogue. it is with the Obama administration, the problem was not that you need to have dialogue as a democratic country. You always initiate not violence, but dialogue, you know. So that was not what I was concerned with. What I was concerned with side by side with that dialogue, you need a critical dialogue. That you do not lose sight of the fact that your true allies are the Iranian people and not the Iranian regime. And that was blurred. That differentiation was blurred. But because I disagreed with Obama, I was not agreeing with Trump.
Sure. Exactly. And it's the polarity, the strong bipolarity of the American political discourse that pushes us in these directions, unfortunately, and makes it, as you say, harder to see the truth and to make choices that are independent and based on our own thinking. I remember, as you were talking, I remember during Bill Clinton's presidency, you opened my eyes to something. At the time, I didn't even really, I couldn't quite grasp it. Bill Clinton had apologized to the Islamic Republic of Iran, the regime, for the coup against Mossadegh. And you were very upset about that because, again, the distinction wasn't made. If he had apologized to the people of Iran, it would have been one thing, but he apologized to the regime, and the regime, of course, was the clerics were responsible in great part for that coup, and there isn't even a street in Iran named after Mossadegh. So a really ill-informed sort of policy that Iranians took offense at, much the same way that Obama was rejected by Iranian people because he chose not to stand with them during the Green Movement. So you also mentioned, and I was really drawn to this in your book, and really relate to it. I feel very much the same way, and very often, I would say even on a daily basis, you talk about guilt. And how you live in a free country, you have your freedoms, not just freedoms, but your comforts, your daily comforts, and yet you and Ladan Burumand, as you mentioned, our mutual friend, others who are working to help free that country and free other countries, are regularly in touch with people who are living under brutal totalitarianism, and it creates guilt. Which is natural. Can you talk about that feeling, and how do you grapple with it on a daily basis?
Sometimes I don't grapple with it. I let it take over me. That feeling of guilt that you're talking about, for me, started as soon as the idea came to my mind that I need to leave. And it came in so many ways, personally, leaving the people you loved behind, and also leaving the country that gave you a lot, you know, that you love. So when I first came to America, I vowed that there were two things that I really wanted to do. One was to keep my freedom and independence of mind and heart, to not belong to any sect or group, and to belong to my values rather than political parties or, you know, things like that. That was the first. The second was to be able to speak about things that I couldn't speak in Iran, because I felt the only way I can assert that guilt is to not talk on my own behalf, but become a voice that talks about what is happening inside Iran, you know. Because Mariam John, there was such condescension, both on the right and the left, about Middle East, and I saw it in terms of Iran.
Yeah.
They both believe that our culture is marriage for females at the age of 9 and mandatory hijab and polygamy. They call it our culture. It is as if I would call racism and burning witches culture of United States, you know. They ignore the 3,000-year civilization. They ignore the civil society inside Iran. They're ignorant. And James Baldwin used to say, ignorance plus power is the worst enemy of justice. You know, and that is what happens here. That they don't know, and on the right they say this is their culture. Muslims are terrible. Muslims should not be allowed in this country. On the left, they say this is their culture. We should not criticize them.
Cultural relativism. We don't know what's worse, actually.
And you know why criticism means that you give equality of. I mean, you know, you're saying that you should know better when you criticize someone. And they act towards us as if we are children. We're not responsible. We will be crushed if we are criticized. We won't be crushed if we are criticized. We would be crushed by prejudice.
Yeah. You mentioned, yes. You mentioned the patronizing attitude on the left, and you have written about the totalitarian instinct in the West. How concerned are you about wokeism, woke politics, identity politics, trends on the left that are really anti-liberal?
I'm worried about any trend that is anti-liberal, regardless of what their ideology is. I mean, when Roe v. Wade happens, I am outraged, and I understand how this attack on women leads to other curtailment of their other rights. But at the same time, I don't think that you can fight for freedom of women or minorities by taking on the language and the mentality of your opponents. I believe in the kind of struggle that Martin Luther King represents and James Baldwin represents. They fought against racism, and they fought for civil rights of the American people. No one can deny that. What we have now, the freedoms we have now, is because of the way they were then. You know? And what I like to see on the left is more Martin Luther King and less the identity politics or other trends.
Yes. Condoleezza Rice, I think, has a sentence that is almost exactly as what your last sentence: more Martin Luther King and less identity politics. Believing in the core fundamentals of the United States Constitution, and actually the idea of equality rather than essentialism and separating people according to how they look, which is racism in the first place. How do you see, because you straddle many worlds, you straddle Iran and the United States. Of course, you're an international figure. I know that when you go, for example, to Italy, you are so widely respected in your book talks, or in other countries also. You straddle those cultural worlds and linguistic worlds, and you also you straddle what it is to be Iranian inside Iran and Iranian in the diaspora. When you look at the diaspora, what do you think? And I will share with you before you express your thoughts, is that I'm very often extremely disappointed in how the diaspora chooses to not think, as Hannah Arendt would say, chooses not to have a conscience when it comes to their unique position as having left Iran because of the lack of freedom, and then having freedom in the country that is their adopted country, and yet choosing not to think, not to act, not to do the things that they know would be helpful to those inside the country who are struggling not just for themselves, but struggling for the freedom of everybody, the freedom of the Iranian people. And of course, when the Iranian people are free, then the Middle East region and all the world is much safer and much freer. What are your thoughts on the diaspora?
No, I agree with you that, first of all, I think what you just said is very important, that when the Iranian people are free, the whole region and the world, in fact, is affected by it. The Islamic Republic was the first regime that conquered through theocracy. It is the first modern theocracy, and they formulated this whole theory of Islamism. I always say the Islamic Republic is the Soviet Union of the Muslim world, that they brought this extremism to the foreground and radicalized others. And their failure is the failure of that totalitarian ideology. So it's very important. But sometimes when you're in diaspora, you don't know. I mean, I empathize with the fact that people are so displaced mentally, psychologically, that they exist in a no man's land type of a thing. And so they become distanced both from the country that they have left behind and the country that they are part of now. Some act as if this country doesn't exist. I consider myself an Iranian American, and I consider the fact that I have a responsibility towards both of these countries, you know. But I understand how difficult it is to not speak on behalf of the whole people, to be able to what I think is the most important thing that people in diaspora can do is two things. One is we are free here, and we can create a space where we would talk and exchange about democracy, what it means to be a democratic country, something like what you want to do, perhaps would trying to educate people, try to not just think that it is enough to criticize the Islamic regime. It's not enough. Right. What is more important even, or as important, is education of us, the Iranian people, about what is democracy. How could you use democratic means to reach a democratic end? How can you avoid these totalitarian trends that are so easy to come? I think that is one of the most important things diaspora can do. And the second thing is to transfer what is happening inside Iran to the world.
Yes.
To not let the Iranian people be forgotten.
Yes.
You know, that these are the two important things.
Yeah. One last question. You mentioned in the book a sentence that really stayed with me. You're talking about the revolution, of course, and you've written about this in your other books. And one of the things that really left an impression on me from your book, Things I Have Been Silent About, is your husband, Bijan Naderi, during the Iranian Revolution. you and others were ardent revolutionaries. You were aligned with the Maoist camp, for example. You believed in a total revolution was necessary. And you wrote about, you have written about how your husband Bijan was much more measured and wise, and he said he believed that Bakhtiar should be given a chance, and that the possibility for reform is actually very very real and very possible, and that the revolution is very dangerous. And in this book, Read Dangerous, which is a position I really respect, and the more we go forward with time, the wisdom of that, I think, assessment is all too obvious. In this book, Read Dangerously, you say, what if we had not given in to the frenzy? What if we had not given into the frenzy? And that this is relevant for you, not just about the revolution in Iran, but about politics in the Western world, particularly the United States. Can you talk a bit about that?
Yeah, that is a question that I will be asking myself for the rest of my life, because that was going into it emotionally is always dangerous, and we lose ourselves, we give up our own identity. And Bijan was right. In fact, to be genuinely liberal, to be genuinely progressive, you how do I say it? I forgot, Mariam.
To be genuinely liberal, you don't get caught up in the frenzy. You
don't get caught up.
Yeah.
To be genuinely liberal, you fight against the frenzy,
including in yourself, right? If you feel it
yes.
in yourself. Yeah.
That is, I'm so glad you brought this up, because of the fact that to be genuinely democratic,
Yes.
you don't only blame the world for what is happening. You look inside yourself. And the most difficult thing in life is facing yourself, facing the devil inside you. I can't tell you how many times in Iran and even in here, I have caught myself acting like them. There were days in Iran where I would walk the streets and say, I want them all dead, with no argument. And you allow hatred to come into your mind. And hatred is so dangerous because it overwhelms your mind.
It destroys yourself, as Martin Luther King says.
Yeah, it does not allow you to be you and to do what you love. So protest should not be always just out of hate. It should be out of outrage, and you should be firm, but it should be out of love. It should be to preserve what you love. And
it should be affirming.
Yeah, and that you cannot do with frenzy. I mean, we're watching every day in the news in America the scenes from January 6th. And the only thing that it does is polarize more and make us self-righteous. Self-righteousness is the worst trait in us humans.
Right. I'm actually concerned about that, is that it on the one hand, it's truth, it's accountability, it's transparency about what's happened. On the other hand, does it add to the other side's resentment and unwillingness to question their own thought patterns, which have been so ingrained? Because, as you mentioned, the James Baldwin quote, they have taken root because there's been a lot of power. I mean, the president of the United States was telling them that this election was stolen, and now it must be very, very hard for some people to change their minds if that's what they've believed.
Yeah, that is where leadership comes in. I mean, people look up to models, and that is where I'm worried about, because it is easy to blame everything on Trump, as it was very easy for us to blame everything on the Islamic Republic. But how Trump and the Islamic Republic came into being, would they have come into being if we acted differently?
Right.
I'm sure it would have been. At the beginning, I remember how media took Trump as a clown. They would give voice. I mean, the guy is talking about Obama not being born in the United States, and they give him space to come and talk about it. You know, they're amused by it. It sells.
It sells, yeah.
The media sold him, and then we and the media itself were caught in what we're still paying for. You know.
Yeah. Azar Nafisi, I can't thank you enough for your time, your wonderful ideas, always a source of inspiration. I'm really grateful to you and grateful to all our viewers and listeners for being with us. Azar Jan, thank you very much again.
Thank you, Mariam Jan. It was great to be talking to you.
It's a pleasure.